It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Sara Van Driest, who will be presenting for us on tips for preparing and delivering scientific talks. Dr. Van Driest is the Director of Pediatrics for the NIH All of Us Research Project and Associate Professor of Pediatrics at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in the Division of General Pediatrics. She was formerly the PI for the Vice MPRINT grant from Vanderbilt University, and it was my extreme pleasure to get to know her better there. And while I'm disappointed that she has left MPRINT, I'm excited for learning how we can work more closely together with all of us in the future, and glad that she is able to come back and present this webinar today on presentation tips. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sara.
Let me share my screen here and I'll look at, can someone give me a thumbs up or a verbal? Okay, great.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sara, for that very kind introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to come back to MPRINT. I was telling Amelia, I feel like the auntie who was very involved in the beginning and then disappeared and is coming back for Christmas or something. And it's like, oh, everyone's all grown up. And so this network is certainly near and dear to my heart, and I appreciate the opportunity to give this talk. This is a bit of an encore presentation of a talk that I developed with a team of folks with ASCPT for a webinar that we put together. And so you can look, there's in that webinar we talked about also posters and some other kinds of scientific presentations. I am going to talk specifically today about 10-minute scientific talks. This is kind of a very common format for talks, but I think this will generalize to other scientific talks as well. And so with that, I'll dive right in. The framework for today is that I'm gonna give some opening comments, and then I'm gonna give actually an example of a 10-minute scientific talk. And so hopefully it'll be a good example. I try to be real thoughtful about how I put it together to make a good 10-minute scientific talk. But before I launch into that, I wanted to define for this group what I think are the criteria for a good scientific talk. At Vanderbilt, I got to work with a medical editor many years ago. Unfortunately, not to edit my work, but just to provide some tips on how to be a good scientific writer. And that editor told me that the job of a scientist when writing is to be clear and honest. And that's it. That we are not novelists, we are not entertainers, we are scientific writers, and you need to be clear and honest. Now, for scientific talks, I think there is a third thing that's really important, is that you need to respect the time limit. I think that a good scientific talk checks these 3 boxes. And so there are lots of other things that might cross your mind as criteria for good or great scientific talks, like entertaining or inspiring or insightful. But I don't think that those are required for a good scientific talk. And as I go through my talk today, I'm going to be honest, and I hope it will be clear, and I'm going to do everything I can to respect the time limit. And so that's my definition of a good scientific talk. And then at the end, I'll go through some places where my particular example could have gone awry and broken my rules and not been as clear, honest, or respectful of the time limit. And there'll be some time at the end. So please think about questions that you might have and other things that you think are tips for helping achieve a really good scientific talk. And we can talk about those before we close. So the talk that I will present today is work that was published in CPT on the effect of CYP3A5 metabolizer status on fentanyl pharmacokinetics in children. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors who are shown here, and I want to specifically note that this work was led by Michael Williams, who's a PhD student who's now graduated from the PhD program here at Vanderbilt. And Lena Choi is my colleague in biostatistics at Vanderbilt and was Michael's PhD supervisor and led a lot of this work. So big kudos to the whole team who led this research effort. By way of disclosures, I have no conflicts of interest, and the agencies who funded this work include the NIH and the Doris Duke Foundation. I will be talking about analyses of data collected on fentanyl in children, where the use is often off-label. The overall goal of this work is to move us towards better prediction for fentanyl in children, which could improve outcomes. We know that fentanyl is a commonly used drug that is used during and after surgery in children, many different kinds of surgery. We also know that pediatric patients can have 10-fold differences in fentanyl dosing requirements. This is a drug with a narrow therapeutic window, meaning that the difference between a therapeutic dose and a toxic dose is relatively small. We also know that there have been many attempts to build pharmacokinetic models for this drug, and there's significant residual variability. One of the reasons for this might be the limited sample size of the studies that have been done, leading to inadequate explanation of the things that are contributing to variability across individuals. An example of one of these prior studies where the sample size was limited is work that I previously did that used a pragmatic approach to look at fentanyl pharmacokinetics in children. So we did a study of 130 pediatric cardiac surgery patients. We extracted data, including dosing and covariate data from electronic health records, and we coupled those data with just over 1,000 fentanyl concentrations that were measured from remnant plasma from these individuals as they proceeded through their clinical postoperative course. When we did that analysis of the 130 individuals, the bullet towards the bottom of the slide listed all the covariates that we tried to include in the model, but all of those covariates, only weight improved the model fit. So that was the only one that was significant. So this pilot study had a relatively large number of individuals for a pediatric PK study. 130 is kind of a lot compared to the sort of dozens of individuals that are typically included in these studies. But you can see in this model diagnostic plot of the observed concentrations on the y-axis versus predicted concentrations on the x-axis that there is still significant variability after we fit the model. That's indicated by the scatter of these dots away from the line of unity on the diagonal. So the goal of the current study that I'm going to tell you about next was to expand this cohort and determine if additional covariates, and specifically CYP3A5 metabolizer status, could help improve this model. So the current study recruited patients who had surgery for congenital heart disease. We obtained DNA and plasma from remnant clinical samples to determine CYP3A5 variants, as well as the fentanyl concentrations. And we extracted data including the fentanyl doses and the covariates from the electronic health records, similar to the pilot study I showed before. We then applied a population PK analysis. And by we, I mean Michael, as I mentioned, who is under Lena's guidance. So the PopPK analysis was done in Monolix 2021R. And again, you can see the covariates that are listed there on the slide. We specifically were interested and wanted to test the effect of CYP3A5 metabolizer status in the model. The final cohort included 434 individuals who had a median age of 9 months. The clean data set included nearly 2,000 fentanyl concentrations. The cohort was predominantly white and CYP3A5 poor metabolizers, which is as expected for a cohort of mostly European ancestry. And so CYP3A5 poor metabolizers had 2 no function alleles, such as star 3 or star 6 in CYP3A5. The base model included 2 compartments, and then we tested our pre-selected covariates to see what would significantly improve model fit. As you can see here, weight, age, and stat score, which is a measure of surgical mortality, were significant. But several other covariates on the right side did not improve the model whatsoever. We then added CYP3A5 metabolizer status and found that it did indeed improve the model fit. So here's one way that we looked at the effect of CYP3A5 metabolizer status on fentanyl clearance. So in this box and whisker plot on the left, clearance is on the y-axis and metabolizer status is on the x-axis. And as you can see, there's a stepwise decrease in the median clearance from normal to intermediate to poor metabolizers. However, you can also see the tremendous variability within these metabolizer groups. Because the participant reported race covariate could be confounded with the CYP3A5 metabolizer status, we did visualize the data stratified by race as reported by the parent of the participant. All of the normal metabolizers had a self-reported race of Black, and we did see a stepwise decrease in clearance within that group. We also see here that individually reported race cannot be used as a proxy for metabolizer status, as among our Black participants, the large majority were intermediate or poor metabolizers. Shown in this figure is a similar model diagnostic plot of the observed fentanyl concentrations on the y-axis versus the predicted concentrations on the x-axis, like I showed at the beginning from the pilot study. Again, if this was a perfectly predictive model, all of the dots would lie on the dashed line. As you can see, we still have some variability that is unexplained by our model. So what did we learn from this study? Well, we could see that age, weight, the STAT score, and CYP3A5 are important covariates for fentanyl pharmacokinetics. This we observed in this cohort of children who had undergone cardiac surgery. However, as I mentioned, significant variability remains. And as a broader conclusion, this is a demonstration of how electronic health records data may be useful for building large cohorts of drug-exposed individuals for pharmacokinetic research. There are some significant limitations to the study, and these need to be mentioned and taken into context when we look at the conclusions. Number one, because we used remnant samples from clinical testing, we have very sparse sampling, and that limits our ability to build a really tight model. We also need to be mindful about the data that we pull from the electronic health records and the quality of those data. We know that there are sometimes errors in, for example, the weight that is measured for the pediatric participant. We want to think carefully about the dosing weight versus the actual weight and the different weights that could sometimes be in a chart. Because we use EHR data, there were covariates that are somewhat obvious choices to be tested in the model, like measures of liver function and albumin measurements, but these weren't available in enough individuals within the cohort to include them in the model to test them. There's a lot of clinical variability within this cohort of kids who undergo cardiac surgery, everything from having a relatively routine procedure to very complex congenital heart disease repairs. And along that spectrum is also a spectrum of how sick these kids were in their postoperative course. We've modeled a little bit of that by using that STAT score, but that doesn't, that probably doesn't completely explain that clinical variability. And then again, I pointed out that we had a predominantly white by self-report and likely European ancestry individuals, and that limits our ability to generalize across diverse populations, which is a really important limitation that we need to work on doing better throughout our field. So there's much more to do in terms of next steps on this study. External validation and including diverse participants is an important piece before this can be used clinically. We want to identify and incorporate additional covariates, which might require larger sample size. Again, we went from 100 to 400, and we probably need to get into the thousands to really nail this down. And then throughout this fentanyl research, which I've been pursuing since my own fellowship in clinical pharmacology, I've been chasing after ways to explain the variability in fentanyl concentrations, but we still don't know the ideal therapeutic concentration, nor whether that's consistent, and it probably isn't consistent across different individuals. So those pharmacodynamic studies and doing those analyses are a really important next step. We do need to explain the pharmacokinetic variability, and that can be very helpful in being able to adjust then for the pharmacokinetic variability when we do the pharmacodynamic studies. All right, so normally if this were a 10-minute scientific talk, for example, at a meeting, we now have a discussion about the scientific content I just presented. And I'd be happy to answer a couple of questions about that, but that's actually not the point of today's discussion. For today's session, we're trying to talk about the form of the talk and rather than the content of it. So hopefully by using things like a very standardized way of providing the content to you, I hope that helped make it clear exactly what I was going for throughout the components of the background, methods, results, and discussion. A couple of things that I keep in mind when I'm putting together talks include bits of wisdom that have been shared with me by my mentors. The primary mentors in my career have been Dan Roden and Mike Ackerman. Dan is at Vanderbilt and Mike is at Mayo. And they're both really fantastic speakers and teachers. One of the tips that they both made sure I kept in mind through all of my preparations for different talks is that you're only going to present the tip of the iceberg. They always encourage me to be really focused on the main message because you are tempted, I think in all phases of your career, to share everything. There's so much work that goes into each data point on every slide, but the listeners will understand that what you're presenting is the tip of the iceberg and that there's so much more that went into it. So give them the opportunity to ask about that and stay focused on that main message. A second thing that was really drilled into me, especially by Mike Ackerman, who was my PhD mentor at Mayo, was to make a really conscious choice before I prepare talks between two goals, which are often mutually exclusive. One goal being making the audience think I am smart. The other goal being making the audience smart. Now, when I have the goal of impressing the audience with fancy science and big terminology, then I will include lots of complex diagrams and a lot of lingo to, really overcome any imposter syndrome I might be feeling, and to, really convince this audience that I am really, really good at this. That does not achieve that other goal of making the audience smarter. So my mentors have coached me to be very intentional about making the audience smarter and to use simple images, use simple language, and to make everything approachable for the audience. So I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to talk about how the 10-minute talk that I gave could have gone awry and things I thought about as I actually put the talk together. One of them is in the background. In the background section, as I put this talk together, I was really tempted to go into a lot of detail about the clinical use of fentanyl and what we already know about the pharmacokinetics of this. And in a manuscript and in a longer talk, I would spend more time talking about the foundational work that's been done, especially in other lab groups who have looked into this drug. For a 10-minute talk, you got to be really choosy about what you present in the introduction. And so I focused on what motivated our team to do the work and what motivated to, or what might motivate you to listen to the talk and to really engage with the content. And then in the methods, this is one of the places, and really through the whole talk, you need to know your audience, but the methods is where you want to be really thoughtful about how you're describing what you went about in your work. And so for this audience, where I know that you all have a clinical pharmacology background, I present the methods in a certain way, including a little bit of information about the actual model building, right? Not a lot, but there's some there. When I present to a clinical audience, I have a very different description of the methods because I know that they will get, they have some, sort of clinical pharmacology barriers to understanding things like modeling. And so I wouldn't, for example, go into the details of the model to any degree with that group because I will lose them. But I would include some more information about the clinical context and how we went about gathering the data and which patients were in the data set. And then in general, throughout life, my advice is to fall in love with people and not data. Before I put this talk together, I was really excited to share some really cool simulation work that Michael did that was adjacent to this work. It's in the paper. It's really cool. It's all of these, like, I love graphs with lots of data and lots of color, but as I practiced the talk and put it together, it didn't fit into the 10-minute presentation. And when I looked at what was really important, what really was essential to my main message about CYP3A5, I realized I had to set that aside. And so these data are in figure 3 of the paper that's published. So I hope that you'll go check that out and look at it. But I didn't include that in my talk. That's one of those below the waterline parts of the iceberg that I had to leave out. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. I hope that you'll feel like this was a good scientific talk. It's not perfect. There's, I don't think, any such thing as a perfect scientific talk. And if there were, it'd be no fun to listen to, because the great part of scientific investigations and of scientific presentations is the discussion that happens afterwards of, you know, what about this? And have you thought about that? And what are you going to do next? And all those good questions. So let me stop here. I'm going to take down my slides. We'll take a look at the chat and other, if folks want to raise their hands or whatnot. And I'd also invite Sarah and others, ask any questions about, you can ask me about the science. I can't resist answering questions about the science, but hopefully also have some talks about, you know, thinking about putting together a scientific talk. And what other tips do you have? Sarah, I've heard you speak, and you always are, you follow my rules. You're clear, you're honest, you respect the time limit. So I'd love to hear what things you and your have been passed on to you by your mentors, or what you've learned from your experience as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Sarah. It was a really exciting, interesting talk, and and I learned some keys and how to tell people to give a good talk. So yeah, we invite anyone who's online, feel free to raise your hand and we can promote you so that you're able to participate in the discussion too. We set this in a webinar format, but we really appreciate discussion as well, or you can type information into the chat as well. So looks like Wei-Chi has a question.
Yes. Hey, Sarah. So I have a question here. Is any suggestion for like whose native language is not English? Because as a foreign speaker, in my mind, every time when I give a talk, the issue is I try to figure out what word I try to use. I try to deliver an accurate message, like you said, to be honest and clear, but our vocabulary source is kind of limited. It's so any suggestion for secondary language?
Yeah. So for folks whose English, or if you're presenting to any group that is using a different language than what you're using, number one, we talked a little bit about this before we even started. Like, you have to really hone down your content so you can speak slowly. That's true if there's any language discordance, and that also includes like if it's the technical language of your talk. So just being really careful about how much content is one piece. For some people, it's really helpful to script out the talk. I know it's I've been to lots of talks about scientific talks where people say like, well, don't read your slides and whatnot. But again, our goal is not, we're not doing a comedy stand-up, right? Our goal is to convey scientific information. And if that's helpful to kind of have a script and talk it out, I think a really great scientific talk might be scripted and might have those words spelled out. And then again, I would also give anyone who's struggling with language, and whether that's actual spoken language or also the technical language, because so much of our work now is collaborative and across fields. So I am not a modeler. So sometimes I stumble on the right words to use in that modeling space when I'm talking to people who are so much more conversant. give yourself permission to say, I'm not sure if I'm using the right word here. In the Q&A part, ask, say, is this the question that you're asking? Am I understanding the question? Take your time to answer, and then ask, did I answer your question? And if not, it's okay to try again. But again, give yourself permission that communication is hard no matter what language you're speaking. I had a speech teacher in college say that communication is like hitting a baseball. If you get it a third of the time, you're a professional. That is how hard communication is. So, so it might take a couple times back and forth, when there's any kinds of language barriers to, it might take 3 times to say, is this the question? No, wait, no, this is what you meant. And that's okay. That's dialogue. So I don't think there's a magic to that. Wei-Chi, I will say that, let me ask if there's skills that you've picked up along the way, because I think you communicate very effectively. What tricks do you use to help you speak when you're not using your native language?
I think practice maybe is in my opinion, probably the most efficient way to do. And I guess, every time when I start a new topic, the most difficult thing is about the nervous, actually. It's about how to manage your time, like you said. And because you may spend more extra time, or you think the audience understand your topic, you'll spend less time. So that's hardest part, probably.
Yeah. I think being really choosy about content, and one of the things I learned in the clinical pharmacogenetic space, we were developing, content. We were trying to, when we were launching our various pharmacogenetic tests in the clinical spaces, so we started generating content for patients and then for providers. And as we developed that content, we realized that it almost all merged to where, the providers really needed a lot of the same language that the patients did. There were some shortcuts we could make when talking to the providers, but not that many. So it's like there's somebody in your audience whose knowledge about the topic you're presenting is probably similar to, your mom or your cousin, or that approaching your talks to make it so that they are understandable by a lay audience is a pretty good strategy. And that way you don't try to jam too much content in. I think that stuffing talks full of content is one of the probably most common ways that they go wrong. And sometimes that's motivated by that kind of want to feel smart. Sometimes it's motivated by, gosh darn it, I spent 4 months working on this piece of data. I'm going to show it, and I'm going to make everyone else feel how painful it was to get this data point. And sometimes it's just, because we're enthusiastic and we want to share everything. Really calling it down to the bare essentials. I'd rather hear 2 minutes about one thing than 20 things in 1 minute, because then I can't remember them all at the end anyway.
All right. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Again, feel free to raise your hand and we can promote you to speaker. I will echo kind of what you've said, Sarah, about practice, keeping things simple are really important. And, when, I've had, mentors tell me, write it out, make the script, but then practice it so much that you don't need the script. And that you do have it memorized. And I think that was really helpful for me. And, I put the things on my slides that I know I may stumble over too, but the words that people may not recognize or may be a little bit more difficult, and then spell it out versus filling your slide with a lot of text that no one's going to read. You want the key points, keeping it simple and easy to understand is very important. So.
And I know I feel like at most meetings now, well, a lot of meetings are hybrid or virtual, and then sometimes you have some control about having, speaker view or being able to see your own notes. When I go to meetings, if I'm giving a talk at a big venue, I will still print out my slides, because I've been at meetings where they said I'm going to have speaker view and then they don't. And so I'm old school. I'll print out my notes, and sometimes sometimes I have a script for, if there's a slide that I'm practicing and I stumble on it every time, I'll script out just that one slide if I need to. Sometimes for really tight talks, I'll script out the whole thing, and large audiences still. I do that as a native English speaker who's been doing this for a number of years. I still sometimes script out talks to make sure I stay on the time limit. I have a tendency to ramble. You probably all noticed that in the Q&A already. So I have to be really careful that when I'm giving a time limited talk that I really, you know, I'm talking too much on this slide. I'll script it out and then I stick to the script, Van Driest, just say what's in the notes. So I will say there, my mentors, both my primary mentors, were of the ilk that the slides should be more visual. And then you provide with your voice the context. My team at All of Us use slides really differently. They'll use slides for people to review content asynchronously. And they're much more of the idea that, you know, slides should be able to stand alone without, you know, my voice talking about it. That if I suddenly went to mute, I could just click through my slides and people would still get 90% of the content. And I think that really comes from two different uses of slide content. It is important to think about that, I think, when you're putting together the slides themselves. You know, who's going to look at these slides? Are people going to really, you know, take your 40 slides and look at them in 10 minutes on their own at their desk? In which case you probably want something different actually on the slides than if they're only going to be used for an oral presentation. In which case I think you can be more sparse with the words on the slides and more visual.
I'll agree there. And actually, as a mentor reviewing slides, sometimes people will send me a slide set and I'm like, I have no idea what you're going to be saying on these slides. So I can't review it without you actually talking through, you know, when you just give me a slide with a picture, which can be an awesome slide and a great visual and a break from all of those tedious data points. But, you know, without having the context of why it's presented, it's difficult to critique. But on the other hand, you know, I think probably what you're seeing too is different venues, right? So if I'm presenting something for my research team, I would use a lot more detail on the slides because I'd expect them to go back and look at them. Or, you know, a lot of times in our didactics courses, we'll present slides with, here's a lot of details. I'm not going to talk about that, but you can go back and look at it. Versus for a 10-minute scientific talk at a national conference where someone in the back of the room is not going to be able to see the data on your slide. And I think one of the things you did in your talk, which you didn't discuss too much in the subsequent, is the figures and tables were very clear. The text was large, and so you can see it from the back of the room, which I think is also important.
Yeah, I don't put anything critical on the bottom like quarter of the slide, because, you know, again, in the old days when meetings were in person, sometimes everyone's heads would be in the way. So I often put that little navigation bar at the bottom with like the background, methods, results, conclusions, because it's a little bit of a filler, but it does kind of help people follow along. But you don't want the critical data anywhere on the bottom quarter because somebody might not be able to see it. Now, if it's an all virtual meeting, then you can use the whole screen. I also often bump my titles way up towards the top. That was something that Dr. Ackerman taught me. Dr. Roden didn't like that at all. He's like, your title's too tall. It looks like it's trying to leap off the page. But I was just trying to like manage the real estate, you know, because the people expect the title at the top, but that's really like, you know, location. That's good stuff up there. So.
Yeah. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A from Michelle Liu. What are some tips to engage the audience for Q&A if there are no questions? And as a moderator, I've come across this many times of how do you get through a Q&A when there's no questions?
So Sarah, I'll ask if you have any tips on this too, but one thing is to pre-populate and to spike the audience with a few questions. Like if there's somebody friendly, or if you know the moderator, you know, sometimes the moderators will ask for questions ahead of time and just say like, you know, what might you like to be asked? And those can be, and those don't have to be softballs. You can ask yourself hard questions. And I like to say they're all hard questions because they all have nuance to them. Another thing to do is to go ahead and again, if you're prepared and you think like, you know, here's the questions I wish I would ask, then if no one's asking a question, you could say, and you can even pretend, no, I don't think anyone's, again, you have to be honest, but you know, you could say something that others have asked me, or one of the things that you just go ahead and spike the discussion yourself. Like, what's that thing that you wished you could have put in your slide? Like the data that I showed that from Michael that I didn't give. And you could say like, well, since there aren't questions, I'm going to use this time to show you this really cool thing that didn't make it into the talk. So let me show you, and then have a backup slide of like, here's this cool thing. You know, you might have asked me about this, and then I would have showed you this. So if you prepare for that a little ahead of time, you can provide the audience a little bit of a breather. The other thing is to be patient. You know, sometimes people just need I'm not good at coming up with questions like immediately in the moment. Like I need a minute to think of my question. And so providing a little filler can sometimes be helpful. Like if somebody just asks a question that you can always ask is, you know, what are you going to do next? Or what was surprising about those? Those are two, Sherry Barkin gave me those. What are you going to do next? What was most surprising about your study? So will somebody ask you those questions, kind of standard questions? Somebody else might come up with their own question too.
A lot of times it's breaking the ice and getting one person to ask a question. And, you know, we're always being recommended to plant those questions, right? Which sometimes is really hard to get someone to tell me what the questions they'd like to be asked are, you know, and, you know, as a moderator, I feel my role is to try to listen and try to come up with some of these questions that might be asked, which then does break the ice a little bit and lets others ask questions. So, James, I saw you raised your hand. You should be able to talk now.
Oh, Jim, you're on mute. Like you're muted on your end. We can
move maybe
we'll come back to you.
Question.
Yeah.
So the other question in the chat is, what's your suggestion on the ideal approach to slides? More visual or standalone?
Yeah, I think this goes back to, you know, it depends on I think how the slides are going to be used. So if you are giving a talk at a national meeting and like that's a single use, you know, no one's going to view the slides except in that context, then I think you can be more visual and just have, I would advise people to have the take home message for the slide on the slide, like written out. You know, this is what I want you to hear from this, or this is what I want you to, this is what I'm trying to tell you with this slide, not just a picture. So have something up there. But again, if this is something that, like if you're going to send a slide deck out for your PI to review, you know, and this is your, you know, your monthly update or your weekly update on your lab content, and then it needs to stand alone, and then you're going to put more words on it. And so I think this, you know, slides aren't just used for slideshows anymore. They're sometimes a summary of your lab notebook, and they're used to convey information, sometimes without you talking through it, in which case you have to have more words. Either it's in the notes underneath the slide or in the slide itself. So it really depends. I do like having something visual. You know, if a slide has only text on it, then you're probably going to have to, just step through that text with the audience. If you say a whole bunch of, if there's a whole bunch of words on the slide and you say a different set of words, neither of those messages is going to come through, because people can't read and listen to two different sets of words and get anything out of that. So if you use a lot of words, you got to say those same words. Does that make sense? Okay. And it looks like we lost
James.
We lost Jim. Yeah.
So yeah. So with that, if there's no other questions, thank you very much for your presentation. And for those who are trainees who will be presenting at our MPRINT Hub annual meeting in a couple of weeks, you know, we hope you have learned something from this talk, or everyone has learned something. But you know, the goal of our trainee session on Wednesday for the annual meeting will be for you to give a 10-minute talk, and then we'll break into small groups and give you some feedback on that talk as well, in a similar manner of this, and discussion of presentations and how we can improve on those. So thank you very much, Sarah, for your time and for this excellent talk. And we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of the weekend and holidays for those who celebrate. Enjoy the weekend.
Thank you. You too.